This will be a reading from a short story called The Hunt Begins, which is a book-only story published in the hard copy, Chronicles of Light, which is a compendium of Final Fantasy XIV short stories. The illustration in this image is from Toshiyuki Itahana, who is the book illustrator and features a young Zenos. So let us begin. This is from Tales from the Calm, The Hunt Begins. One might think it is a blessing to be born into the ruling family of a vast and powerful empire, but for the young Prince Zenos, great-grandson of Solus Galvus, revered founding father of the Garlean Empire, it was a curse. From the beginning, Zenos was alone. His lady mother succumbed to illness shortly after bringing him into the world, and his lord father was seldom present, occupied as he was with his military campaigns and political maneuvering. And while the prince was surrounded by countless servants, they were as machina to him, trundling about on invisible rails, bereft of independent thought. Nor did he hold the learned men and women who served as his tutors in much higher regard. His brilliant mind found their lessons, their very existence, monotonous, and he preferred the silent company of books. With such an upbringing he could not choose but be different from other children. Indeed, it could be said that he was never a child at all. Innocence and playfulness were quite alien to him, the former expunged by his earliest schooling, and the latter afforded no outlet. His days were uniformly joyless, and he went about his scheduled tasks with apathy. Thus did he pass his first 4 intense summers in a steel-gray blur of tedium. "Arm yourself," the stranger ordered without preamble. Today, as per routine, Zenos had come to the training hall for his martial drills, a crucial part of any future emperor's education. But this time he found not his usual tutor waiting for him, but an unfamiliar figure. The man's skin, baked copper by the sun, was an uncommon sight in the frozen climes of the imperial capital, and he was small of stature if sinuously muscled. Most telling of all, however, was the absence of a third eye upon his forehead. This man was not Garlean, but a native of one of the provinces. And there Zenos lost what little interest he had in the foreigner. Having assessed his appearance, the spark of curiosity promptly faded from the prince's eyes. Wearily Zenos nodded. A different tutor, he thought, for the selfsame lesson. Hours of being reminded to grip his sword correctly, of being told to stand this way and that. Combat training was as numbingly dull as academic studies, but he had not the will to refuse any more, if indeed he ever had. Zenos reached out and grasped a practice sword from the rack, and found the hall's cold floor pressed against his face. What in the world? He instinctively tried to regain his feet, but the floor shifted beneath him and he fell back down. The pain in the back of his skull told him that he had been struck, though he neither saw nor heard his assailant's approach. "You are dead," the foreigner said, as he stood over Zenos, his voice betraying no emotion. He spun on his heels and strode off. "Wait, we haven't even started," Zenos muttered groggily, as he tried again in vain to clamber to his feet. His tutor did not spare him a backward glance. The dead do not learn, they sleep. That encounter marked a change in Zenos' routine. Whereas before martial drills took place thrice weekly, and never on consecutive days, the very next day he was summoned to the training hall once more. "Arm yourself." The same words uttered in the same tone. This time Zenos knew better than to take his eyes off his nameless tutor. He crept over to the weapons rack, snatched up his blade, and raised it hurriedly in a defensive stance, for all the good that it did. Though he was certain he was beyond striking range, he was taken square in the chest and sent sprawling. As before, he caught not a glimpse of his opponent's blade, and thus the drills continue all week, ending before they had even begun. Save in the fleeting company of his lord father, this was, as far as Zenos could recall, the first time he had found himself in a situation beyond his control. Even had his tutors not treated him with deference, Zenos had always had the better of them, regularly surprising them with brilliance. It could scarcely have been more different with his foreigner. He accorded Zenos not a shred of respect, and if he was trying to teach, he gave no indication of it. All he seemed interested in doing was demonstrating the peerlessness of his own swordsmanship. The 10th day saw Zenos limping back to his chambers, cradling a throbbing shoulder, when his father's voice rang out behind him. How goes your training? As if you don't know. Though his clothing did a good job of hiding the countless welts and bruises now covering his body, Varus would have received the reports from his son's servants. He knew full well about these daily thrashings and had permitted them to continue. Very well, father, Zenos replied, smiling. It was a twisted trial for a father to impose upon his son, yet Zenos felt neither indignation nor humiliation. Whatever his father's true intent, he regarded the adversity as a gift. Up until this point in his life, he had faced no challenge worthy of the name, and the one that his newest tutor presented instilled him with a burning sense of purpose, a reason to rise each morning rooted not in duty but desire. Without further word, Varus nodded, and left Zenos as he found him, so ending their first encounter in moons. 2 painful and invigorating weeks passed. While Zenos was still unable to swing his blade in reply to his opponent, he could now make out the arc of his blows, and long after his tutor had taken his leave, he could be seen training alone each day, honing skills and tempering flesh. But skill and strength are not enough, Zenos realized. I require knowledge. And so he took to scouring tomes in the royal library in a bid to identify the techniques being employed against him. At length he found his answer within conquest records written by a pious prior. The style it inspired was called the Unyielding Blade, and inhaled from the region of Corvos in southern Ilsbard. Now armed with a name, Zeno set out next to find treatises on the subject, but instructional resources proved elusive, and his search yielded no fruit. If anything, however, this only added to the thrill of the hunt. So be it. If the techniques cannot be had through text, I shall acquire them through practice. The following week, Zenos made it his mission to observe his opponent's every movement, even if it meant leaving himself open to a good beating. From his footwork to his stance to his strokes, he drank it all in, as a thirsty man drains his cup. And by the time a moon had passed, he found he could turn away some few strikes before succumbing to the onslaught. Arm yourself, he ordered as Zenos took his place. The boy had improved in recent days, he had to concede, but there were limits that he could never overcome. Even with a willing teacher, he added inwardly. Today would doubtless bring more of the same. He watched as his charge reached out and grasped a practiced sword from the rack, and slashed at him without warning. The boy was a good 10 paces away. Short of throwing his sword, he could not hope to reach him. Yet an instant later he found himself scrambling to dodge the energy wave that hurtled narrowly past his side. You, how did you do that? He could not hide his shock at having his own technique used against him, for the unyielding blade was passed down only from master to pupil, and he was the last remaining soul to bear the title of sword master. A native of subjugated Corvus, he and his fellow practitioners had risen up against their imperial oppressors, but for all their skill at arms, they had found themselves hopelessly outnumbered. The forces led by Varus crushed their rebellion and slew all of its members, but for good or ill, he alone had been spared their fate and clapped in iron instead. On Varus's orders, he had then been brought to the imperial capital specifically to train Zenos, while his family was taken hostage to guarantee his obedience. Their faces flashed before his eyes, only to disappear when the boy cleared his throat. What Zenos had done defied all reason. Even had there been some other swordmaster to impart the unyielding blade's secrets to him, he should not have been able to employ the technique, for the style required the practitioner to imbue his weapons with his own ether, an ability famously beyond the reach of true-born Garleans. Yet here was a true-born Garlean, and a stripling at that, who had mastered the technique in less than a moon. It was impossible, unthinkable, unforgivable. You seem surprised, Zenos replied flatly. Why? The room seemed to turn red. Do not insult me, boy, he managed, his voice trembling slightly. Ours is a proud art with a 1,000-year history. The remark had caught him to the quick, slicing through the facade of indifference he had attempted to maintain, Initiating an impudent prince into his style had never been his intent. Nay, he had come to the imperial palace intent upon assassinating the boy's father, Varus, even if it meant sacrificing his wife and daughter. No price was too high to avenge his fallen comrades. The gods will forgive me, he had told himself more. But now he decided to cast aside all his carefully laid plans, all his patiently bided time, and slay the boy who stood before him. He would not suffer a guardian, least of all the issue of his loathed foe, to steal the techniques his forebears had spent generations perfecting. He could not conceive of a greater dishonor to their legacy. The unyielding blade is not for the likes of you to wield. Even with blunted practice swords, masters of the style can empower their weapons with ether to kill with ease. And so he charged at Zenos, hatred contorting his features. But instead of flinching, the boy scoffed in disdain, and he felt a flash of annoyance. He had expected to finish it quickly. With each strike that failed to find its mark, however, his confidence waned. Zenos was an impenetrable wall of ice, nullifying his onslaught of energy waves with his own, while scarcely seeming to move. He had stayed his blade for but a heartbeat to consider his next move when Zenos lunged at him. The slashes came at him from everywhere and nowhere as a pack of hounds snapping at prey in the dark, and it was all he could do to fend them off. The boy's movements seemed random, yet there was a method to the madness, one to which he had no answer. Ere long he found himself backed against a corner, the grip of his sword slick with sweat. So thoroughly overwhelmed, he was forced to admit that Zenos was no pampered prince to be scorned, but a true warrior to be feared. But he would not, could not, admit defeat. "No," he whispered through gritted teeth. "Not to you. Not today." With a savage roar he threw himself at Zenos, bringing his weapons down with every fiber of his being, willing it to strike home. The blade sang as it traced a vicious arc through the air, and fell from limp fingers to the floor with a clang. He looked down to see his lifeblood blossoming upon his chest, dripping from Zenos's hands, still gripping the sword hilt. "The dead do not learn, they sleep. Is that not so?" Zenos whispered by the Corvosi's ear. But his only response was to collapse to the ground, the sword still lodged in his breast, eyes open but unseeing. Zenos bared a bloody hand to his slain foe. There, embedded in the cup of his palm, glinted a crystal fragment. "I have learned two things, however. First, the inability to manipulate ether is a vexing disadvantage, and one which must be addressed." Without so much as a blink, Zenos plucked the crystal free of his flesh, his own blood oozing from the open wound. He had buried it in his palm in a bid to force his body to release ether, and the risks had been great. In the worst case, his body's ethereal balance could have been altered irreversibly, even fatally. Yet in full knowledge of the dangers, naught else would suffice but to sate his curiosity and put this new fighting style to the proof. Zenos continued. "Second, battle offers no euphoria, despite what the tales may claim. Deep down, I had always known this, yet I find myself disappointed none the less." He tossed the crystal at his opponent's corpse. "Your payment for these two lessons." So it was that Zenos Aegalvus's first true battle came to an end. Without further ceremony he quit the training hall, washed, and put on fresh clothes. By the time he sat at table for his evening repast, he had quite forgotten the face of his tutor, and as he settled into bed he prayed as earnestly as a boy of his years might, that one day he would cross paths with a worthy foe, and feel such exhilaration as the heroic epics promised. And then, with a sigh, he closed his eyes and knew the soundest sleep he had ever known. Thus concludes The Hunt Begins from the Chronicles of Light, Final Fantasy XIV.